The house at the edge of town. The old Victorian house loomed at the end of Maple Street, a fixture of Oak Haven yet separate, somehow, from the town's vibrant heart. Its faded paint was cracked, weathered from years of unchanging exposure to sun, wind, and rain. The windows, dusty and draped with heavy curtains, gave the house an air of abandonment and mystery. Children dared each other to approach it. Teenagers shared rumors, and adults shook their heads, muttering the name of the man inside, Thomas Blackwood. Thomas had once been a spirited, lively young man, full of laughter and ambition. In his youth, he was known for his charisma and kindness, captivating everyone he met with stories of his travels and his dreams of making a mark on the world. Oak Haven remembered him as a young man in love, deeply enamored with a woman named Emily, whose presence was like sunlight in the town. Their bond seemed indestructible, a love story that everyone believed would last forever. But then, Emily was lost in a tragic accident. The details of that night became vague over time, clouded by retellings and speculations, but the aftermath was clear. Her sudden absence plunged Thomas into a state of isolation that became his existence. Once his anchor to joy, Emily's memory became an echo of pain too heavy to carry in a world that continued without her. Thomas retreated, first into his home, and then into himself. One by one, he cut the ties that connected him to Oak Haven, his friends, his family, even his career, until there was nothing left but the quiet house and the garden, which he began to tend with almost religious care. Thomas's solitary life became a legend in Oak Haven. In those first years, neighbors would stop by, bringing food or offering help, but he always declined with a polite nod. The few who managed to catch a glimpse of him described a hollow man, thin and pale, his once bright eyes now dimmed. Over time, people stopped trying, though his name continued to drift through conversations, a reminder of life's fragility. Yet even in his isolation, Thomas observed the world. His house overlooked Maple Street, where he would sometimes sit by the window, watching people pass, or gaze out at the park in the distance. He watched as children played, couples strolled by hand in hand, and elderly friends laughed together. But he remained apart, as though there were an invisible barrier separating him from the world outside. The routine was broken one crisp autumn morning. Officer Daniel Miller, a young, well-regarded member of the Oak Haven Police Department, arrived in front of Thomas's house in his patrol car. His arrival caused quite a stir. People whispered, wondering what had finally broken the silence of Thomas's house. Officer Miller, the son of Oak Haven natives who remembered Thomas's earlier life, had heard stories of the reclusive man, but he hadn't expected the scene that awaited him inside. He approached the door and knocked, calling Thomas's name. There was no answer. Miller tried again, louder this time, and again received only silence. A strange unease grew in his chest. Summoning his courage, Miller twisted the doorknob, finding it unlocked, and stepped into the house. The air inside was heavy, stale, tinged with a faint odor of dust and something else, something dark and indefinable. The rooms were in disarray, cluttered with books, papers, and odd trinkets from a life long neglected. A faded photograph on the wall caught Miller's eye, a young couple smiling against the backdrop of a sunny day. The man's face was unmistakable, Thomas Blackwood in his youth, beaming alongside a woman with a radiant smile. The sight stirred something in Miller, who knew instantly that the woman must have been Emily. As he moved through the house, Officer Miller's footsteps echoed, filling the silence like a soft drumbeat. The living room held piles of books scattered across the floor, titles obscured by a thick layer of dust. In the kitchen, plates and cups were stacked in the sink, long abandoned, their contents fossilized by time. Each room was a snapshot of a life that had slowly faded away, a relic of memories preserved through inertia alone. It was in the attic, however, that Officer Miller made the discovery that would change the town of Oak Haven forever. Ascending the narrow staircase, his flashlight slicing through the dark, he pushed open the door to the attic shivering at the sudden drop in temperature. The air was dense, as if time had solidified there, holding its breath. In the middle of the room sat a worn armchair, and in that armchair, Thomas Blackwood. His head was slumped, his body utterly still, hands resting on the armrests, a thin coat draped over his frail frame. But Miller's gaze was drawn to what lay beside Thomas, a small wooden box, open just slightly, its contents partially revealed. The officer approached carefully, his heart heavy with the weight of the moment. With a mixture of reverence and trepidation, he lifted the box, looking inside. The contents of the box were unexpected, a stack of notebooks, each one meticulously bound, their covers faded and edges worn. Miller took the first notebook, flipping open to the first page, where a single sentence was scrawled in a shaky but determined hand, "To my beloved Emily, in whose absence I found myself." As Miller read, he was astonished at the intimacy, the rawness of emotion poured into each page. Thomas's words revealed a man shattered by loss, who had once loved with a depth and intensity few could fathom. The entries shifted from his memories of Emily, the woman who had filled his life with warmth and joy, to his descent into solitude, his despair, and the years he spent trying to piece together fragments of himself within the walls of his home. With each page, Miller's understanding of Thomas deepened. This was no ordinary story of a man overcome by loneliness. It was the chronicle of a heart trying desperately to keep a love alive, despite the cold, relentless march of time. Leaving the attic that day, Miller understood that he had not simply discovered the secrets of a reclusive man. He had unlocked a love story, a tragic, beautiful account that demanded to be shared. And so, he resolved to ensure that Thomas's legacy, his love for Emily, would not fade in the shadows of the house on Maple Street. As Officer Miller prepared to leave, the weight of what he'd uncovered pressed down on him. He knew that he couldn't keep this story to himself. He owed it to Thomas, and to the town, to reveal the truth. The notebooks were no longer just the ramblings of a heartbroken man. They were a message, a plea for understanding, and perhaps redemption. That day marked the beginning of a profound journey for Oakhaven, as the town braced to confront the man they had forgotten, and the love they had never known. The town confronts its own reflection. The discovery in the attic of Thomas Blackwood's house spread quickly through Oakhaven, a quiet town nestled between sprawling hills and dense forests. Oakhaven wasn't used to mysteries, let alone the kind that spanned decades and ended in tragedy. News that Officer Miller had found notebooks full of deeply personal thoughts and revelations from the long-forgotten recluse sent a ripple of shock and morbid curiosity through the town. The Oakhaven Gazette, a modest newspaper with an equally modest readership, was the first to cover the story. With Officer Miller's permission, the editor published a few lines from Thomas's notebooks in the Saturday issue. They chose one of his softer passages, where Thomas wrote about a morning he spent with Emily by the lake, her laughter echoing off the water, and the way her smile lit up everything around her. He described the smell of her perfume and the sound of the birds, framing a scene so vivid and tender that readers felt as if they'd been there. The response was immediate and visceral. People crowded outside the Gazette office, asking for more copies, requesting to read more of Thomas's words. There was a newfound fascination with Thomas's life, a curiosity that grew with each whispered conversation. The town, once content to let him live in silence and solitude, now buzzed with the need to understand him. But under that curiosity lay something deeper: guilt. For years, Oakhaven had seen Thomas as a shadow, a ghost who passed in and out of his house, hardly ever making eye contact with anyone. People had written him off as an oddity, a strange relic of the past. Yet now, seeing his life laid bare on those pages, they realized just how little they had understood. They had whispered about him, yes, but they had never truly looked at him. They had taken his silence for granted, assuming that his self-imposed isolation was a sign of bitterness, rather than what it was, a wounded man's attempt to protect a heart still clinging to the memories of someone he could never let go. As the days passed, the story became more layered. Officer Miller, now somewhat reluctantly in the role of town historian, began to sift through Thomas's notebooks and the remnants of his life. Each entry painted a fuller picture, revealing the depths of Thomas's heartbreak, his reflections on love, loss, and loneliness, and his raw, unfiltered musings about the world he had once been so eager to embrace. In the weeks following his death, Miller spent more time at the Victorian house than he did his own. He catalogued the notebooks and sorted through Thomas's letters, photographs, and relics, feeling as though he were curating an intimate museum piece by piece. Each object he uncovered gave new dimension to Thomas's story, forcing Miller to confront his own assumptions and biases. He had believed, like many others, that Thomas was simply an eccentric, a man who had turned his back on life out of choice rather than circumstance. Now he understood how profoundly wrong he'd been. Miller's work drew the attention of many in the town. Curiosity turned to reverence, and people began to volunteer to help, seeing their efforts as a tribute to the man they had misunderstood. This newfound respect didn't erase years of neglect, but it gave the town a sense of closure they hadn't realized they needed. One of the volunteers was Eleanor, an elderly woman who had been Thomas's neighbor for decades. She was the last person to see him before he retreated into his solitude, and her memories of Thomas offered insights that even his writings couldn't provide. Eleanor told Miller about the days when Thomas and Emily were inseparable, a young couple always seen holding hands, laughing, sharing quiet moments in the park, lost in each other's presence. She spoke of the brightness they'd brought to each other, a light that once seemed invincible. Then, after Emily's accident, that light faded, and Eleanor witnessed the slow unraveling of the man she once called her friend. "I'll never forget that look in his eyes," she said, her voice trembling. It was as if he had died with her that day, but his body just kept going. He was a ghost of himself, you see. And then, little by little, he stopped showing up in town. We all knew he was still there, behind those curtains, but we just let him be. Miller listened, jotting down notes, each detail adding another layer to his understanding of the man who had once been an inseparable part of Oak Haven's heartbeat. Eleanor's recollections began to reshape the town's view of Thomas. He was no longer simply the silent recluse. He was a man whose heart had been cleaved in two, whose life was shattered in a single moment, leaving him to pick up the pieces in solitude. And as the story circulated, Oak Haven found itself grappling with difficult questions. How many other Thomases were out there? How many people did they pass by each day, assuming they were fine simply because they chose not to share their inner struggles? How many lives went unnoticed, misunderstood, judged unfairly? It was as if Thomas's silence had held a mirror up to the town, forcing them to see not only him but themselves. The more Miller uncovered, the more he realized the importance of sharing Thomas's story. But he wanted to do so carefully, respectfully. This was not just a tragic tale. It was a testament to the enduring power of love and the devastating impact of loss. He decided to reach out to a local historian, Geraldine Mayfield, who had grown up in Oak Haven and had a deep understanding of its roots and culture. Together, they planned a series of public readings at the community center, where excerpts from Thomas's notebooks would be shared with the townspeople. The readings would allow Oak Haven to confront its past and come to terms with the pain hidden in plain sight for so many years. The first reading was held in the community center's main hall, where wooden chairs creaked under the weight of a larger-than-expected audience. The air was thick with anticipation as Geraldine introduced Thomas's story. She chose an early entry from his notebooks, describing a sunny afternoon spent with Emily. Thomas wrote about their plans for the future, the dreams they had shared, and his absolute certainty that their love would carry them through anything. For the first time, Thomas's words were heard aloud, and they were beautiful, poignant, rich with the kind of passion and hope that everyone could relate to. As the passage ended, there was a collective silence in the room, a silence so deep it seemed to echo, amplifying the weight of the words left unspoken. Miller scanned the audience, noting the looks of sorrow, regret, and something deeper, a shared sense of loss, a recognition of their own complicity in Thomas's forgotten life. Some wiped their eyes, others sat with heads bowed. The townspeople of Oak Haven, once so eager to dismiss the man they didn't understand, were now grappling with the reality of his story. They weren't just mourners at the wake of a neighbor. They were participants in a story that had touched them all, a tragedy that belonged to the town as much as it did to Thomas. From that evening forward, the readings became a regular event. Geraldine and Miller would meet in the evenings, discussing which passages to share, deliberating over how to honor the life that had unfolded within the pages of those notebooks. As more of Thomas's story came to light, Oak Haven transformed. People who had once lived in silence and isolation were inspired to share their own stories. Those who had lost loved ones, who had faced depression, or who had been marked by life's hardships began to speak up. Inspired by Thomas's vulnerability, they found the courage to be seen. In the months that followed, a movement blossomed in Oak Haven, a drive to foster empathy and connection within the community. Support groups formed, meeting weekly in the town's library. Local business owners began hosting events to promote mental health awareness. The school organized talks to teach students about the importance of compassion and looking beyond the surface. Officer Miller found himself at the heart of this transformation. His connection to Thomas's story had awoken in him a calling he hadn't known he possessed. He became a trusted figure, a source of strength and wisdom for those seeking solace and understanding. With each new gathering, each conversation, he felt the impact of Thomas's story ripple through Oak Haven. And though Thomas Blackwood was gone, his words remained, a bridge between past and present, a testament to a love that had endured despite the odds. The townspeople of Oak Haven, once dismissive and distant, were learning to confront their own roles in the quiet tragedies around them. They had spent years looking away, but now they were learning to see, not just Thomas, but each other. The old Victorian house at the edge of town was no longer a symbol of isolation. It was a reminder of connection, a landmark of a love story that had forever changed Oak Haven. As the readings continued, and the town united around Thomas's memory, Officer Miller knew that this was only the beginning. Thomas's story had breathed new life into Oak Haven, weaving a legacy that would continue to inspire, challenge, and transform the people who had once looked past him. The unfolding of secrets. The regular readings at the community center became more than just a ritual for Oak Haven. They became a pilgrimage of sorts, a gathering where the townspeople came to confront not only the past, but their own reflections within it. As they delved deeper into Thomas's notebooks, each line was like a puzzle piece slotting into the broader story of a life marked by love, loss, and a complex tapestry of memory. And beneath the familiar words, hints of another layer began to emerge, a sense that there were pieces of Thomas's life still unknown, secrets woven between the lines. Officer Miller found himself lingering in the attic of the Victorian house more often, combing through Thomas's personal effects with an almost reverent care. The notebooks held the bulk of Thomas's story, but scattered amidst the clutter of old furniture and forgotten relics were other fragments, a ticket stub to a long-closed opera house, faded sketches of a familiar hillside, notes scrawled hastily on napkins from long-shuttered diners. Miller began to suspect there was something more to Thomas's life than even the notebooks revealed. One chilly autumn evening, as the trees shed their last remnants of color, Miller returned to the attic with Eleanor, Thomas's elderly neighbor and one of the few people who had known him in his earlier days. She had become something of a guide to him, helping him understand Thomas not just as the reclusive figure he became, but as the vibrant young man he once was. "This was always his space," Eleanor said softly, touching the worn wood of the banister as they climbed. "Back when I knew him, he used to spend hours up here. After Emily passed, I think it became a sort of sanctuary for him, a place where he could be alone with his thoughts and memories." As they entered the attic, Eleanor's eyes softened, gazing at the boxes and trinkets with a mixture of nostalgia and sorrow. She paused by the chair where Thomas had spent his final moments, her hand resting lightly on the armrest. "I often wonder if we could have done more," she said, almost to herself. "If only we had known." Officer Miller knew the regret that weighed on her. He had felt it too, along with many others in the town. He knelt down to sift through a stack of old letters that he hadn't yet examined. As he read, a particular phrase caught his eye: the lake house. It was scrawled across several of the envelopes, alongside the name Emily. He picked one up, reading aloud to Eleanor. "The lake house was always our sanctuary, our dream. I can still see the reflection of her laughter on the water's edge, still feel her presence in the air, as if she's waiting there, just beyond my reach." Miller felt a pang in his chest as he continued, realizing that Thomas's notebooks were more than a record of memory. They were an attempt to keep Emily's spirit alive, to preserve her essence in ink and paper. But the mention of the lake house intrigued him, as if it were a door to a hidden part of Thomas's story. "Eleanor," he said thoughtfully, "do you know anything about a lake house?" She looked up, her brow furrowing. "Yes, actually. Thomas and Emily spent many summers at a small cottage by the lake, just outside town. They called it the lake house. It was their retreat, where they'd go to escape the world. After her accident, Thomas rarely went back. It was like he couldn't bear to be there without her." The idea of the lake house lingered in Miller's mind long after Eleanor left that evening. The following morning, he decided to visit the place. If there were any remaining secrets to uncover, perhaps the lake house would reveal them. The journey to the lake house was quiet, winding along narrow roads bordered by trees that framed the sky in a patchwork of amber and gold. The cottage came into view, nestled by the water's edge, its weathered walls and crumbling porch a testament to years of neglect. It was as if time had stopped here, preserving the memories Thomas and Emily had once created within its walls. Miller stepped out of his car, feeling the chill settle over him as he approached. The air was thick with the smell of damp leaves and aged wood, and he found himself listening to the whisper of the lake lapping against the shore, imagining how it must have sounded to Thomas and Emily on quiet afternoons spent in each other's company. Inside, the cottage was surprisingly untouched. Dust lay thick on every surface, and cobwebs stretched like veils across the corners. Miller felt as though he were walking into a snapshot of the past, an intimate space held together by memory alone. As he moved through the small rooms, he saw remnants of their life: a faded quilt on the bed, a pair of glasses folded neatly on the bedside table, an old book left open to a page with a pressed flower marking the spot. In the living room, a small bookshelf caught his attention. Tucked among the worn paperbacks and hardcover classics was a leather-bound journal, its edges frayed with use. Miller hesitated before reaching for it, half expecting to find Thomas's familiar script inside. Instead, he found Emily's handwriting, her neat, looping letters filling the pages. Miller's breath caught as he realized what he held: Emily's journal, a record of her thoughts, her dreams, her life before it was cut short. He opened it carefully, reading her words as though she were speaking directly to him, bridging the gap between life and death, between past and present. Her entries were filled with reflections on love, plans for the future, and musings on the life she and Thomas would build together. But as he reached the final pages, a darker theme began to emerge, a series of entries that hinted at something troubling, something that had clouded their seemingly perfect world. "Thomas doesn't know yet." One entry read, her script hurried, almost frantic. "But I fear it will change everything. I can't bear to tell him. It would break his heart. I wish things could stay as they are, but I know the truth can't be hidden forever." Miller's hands trembled as he read the words. There was something Emily had kept from Thomas, a truth she had struggled to reveal. And then, just before the entries ended, he found a final note, scrawled in the same rushed hand. "If something happens to me, tell them. Please, whoever finds this, tell him I loved him more than anything in this world. Tell him I'm sorry." The note hung in the air, filling the silent cottage with an unspoken sorrow. Miller stood there, his mind racing, trying to piece together what Emily could have meant. Was it a health issue, something she had learned shortly before her accident? Or was it something deeper, a truth that had been woven into the fabric of their lives, invisible to Thomas but deeply known to her? He knew that he had to bring the journal back to Oak Haven, to continue unraveling the threads of their story. But as he drove back, his mind lingered on Emily's final plea. Tell him I loved him. She hadn't had the chance to say goodbye, to explain herself or share her burden. And in the years that followed her passing, Thomas had carried the weight of her absence without ever knowing the truth she had kept hidden. When he returned to town, Miller shared the journal with Geraldine, the historian who had helped with the readings, and Eleanor. They read Emily's words in silence, absorbing the newfound depth of her love for Thomas, and the pain of the secret she had taken to her grave. The townspeople, too, felt the weight of this revelation when it was shared during the next reading. Emily's journal entries added a new dimension to her story, transforming her from a tragic figure into a complex, layered woman who had loved fiercely and struggled silently with a truth she couldn't bear to share. People who had once viewed Thomas and Emily as symbols of simple romance now saw them as a mirror, reflecting the hidden battles that so many people faced in their own lives. The revelation deepened Oak Haven's compassion, sparking conversations about trust, secrecy, and the delicate balance of relationships. Couples began to attend the readings together, drawn by the layers of love and hardship in Thomas and Emily's story. And for the first time, Oak Haven's community center hosted events focused on relationship counseling and mental health. As Oak Haven gathered, week after week, to hear Thomas's story unfold, they realized that they were not simply witnesses to a tragic love story. They were participants, bound together by the shared experiences of love, loss, and the secrets we hold close. And as they embraced the complexities of Thomas and Emily's lives, they began to see each other in a new light, bound by a common understanding that no one's story was as simple as it seemed. In time, the town erected a small memorial by the lake house, a stone engraved with Emily's final words, "Tell him I loved him." It stood as a reminder of the fragile, precious nature of love and the importance of honesty and compassion. People came from all over, leaving flowers, poems, and notes on the stone, paying tribute to the love that had woven itself into the fabric of Oak Haven. And as Officer Miller stood by the lake one evening, watching the water ripple beneath the stars, he realized that Thomas and Emily's story had transformed the town in ways neither could have imagined. They had become symbols not just of love and loss, but of a community's awakening, a testament to the importance of empathy and understanding. But even as the town embraced their legacy, Miller knew there was still more to uncover, secrets hidden in the attic, in the notebooks, and perhaps even in the hearts of those who had once known Thomas. He felt a responsibility to honor their memory, to ensure that their story was told with honesty and care. Oak Haven was changing, and so was he. And as he gazed across the lake, he knew that the journey was far from over. The burden of secrets. The lake house revelation rippled through Oak Haven, settling into the collective consciousness like an unsettled fog. Emily's journal had unearthed a side of her that no one had known. A woman torn between love and a secret so significant that she'd kept it hidden, even from Thomas. Her plea, "Tell him I loved him," was an echo that seemed to haunt every corner of the town, resonating in the hearts of people who, for the first time, saw their own struggles reflected in her words. Yet, as powerful as the revelation was, it left the townspeople with more questions than answers. What had Emily meant? What secret could she have hidden from Thomas? And why would she believe that it would break his heart? The questions gnawed at them, casting an even deeper mystery over a story that had already enraptured them. Officer Miller felt this pull more acutely than anyone. He'd become the reluctant custodian of the Blackwoods' legacy, his days consumed by piecing together the fragments of their lives. He often found himself at the Victorian house late into the evening, sifting through boxes of forgotten letters, photographs, and keepsakes in search of something. anything that might explain the enigma Emily had left behind. One evening, as the moon hung low over Oak Haven, Miller was meticulously examining a set of envelopes in the attic. Most were unremarkable, containing routine correspondence or bills, but his attention was caught by one envelope that had been tucked away at the bottom of the pile. It was addressed to Emily, but had never been opened. The postmark was from the month before her death, and the return address bore the name of a private medical practice in the nearby city. Miller's heart pounded as he opened the envelope, hands trembling. Inside was a single page, and as he read it, a new layer of the story began to unfold. The letter was from a doctor, explaining in clinical language a diagnosis and the need for further tests. The words were somber, laden with implications that took his breath away. Emily had been ill, and it was likely she'd known that her time was limited. The revelation hit Miller like a tidal wave. The weight of her secret became immediately clear. She had faced her own mortality alone, choosing not to share this burden with Thomas. Perhaps she'd feared that telling him would only deepen his inevitable sorrow, that he would suffer twice, first in anticipation of her loss, and again in the finality of it. But in choosing to bear her illness alone, she had left Thomas with the burden of not knowing, a grief unmoored and unresolved. The next morning, Miller shared the letter with Geraldine and Eleanor, who were as stunned as he had been. The implications of Emily's diagnosis, combined with her decision to keep it hidden, added a new depth to their story. For Eleanor, it brought a bittersweet clarity to the memories she held of Emily's final days. "I remember the last time I saw her," Eleanor murmured, her voice trembling as she clutched the letter in her hands. She looked pale, more fragile than I'd ever seen her. I thought maybe she was just tired. She smiled, but there was something haunted in her eyes, something she wasn't saying. If only I had known. The townspeople were shaken by this new layer of tragedy. For them, Emily's choice was both heartbreaking and hauntingly beautiful, a testament to her devotion to Thomas, even in the face of her own suffering. It became clear that her love for him had been so profound that she had chosen to spare him from months, perhaps years, of watching her fade away. With this knowledge, the readings at the community center took on a somber, reverential tone. When Geraldine read aloud the passages where Thomas had written about his bewilderment, his pain, and his unending questions, it was as though the town could feel his anguish anew. And as Emily's secret was shared, they realized that the story they had thought they knew was deeper, more complex than any of them had imagined. This deepening understanding transformed Oak Haven. Thomas and Emily's story became a mirror, reflecting the silent burdens so many carried in their own lives. Inspired by the Blackwoods story, more people came forward to share their experiences, their hidden struggles, their own secrets they had kept for years. The town was changing, becoming a place where silence no longer held the same power, where vulnerability became an unspoken bond connecting everyone. Yet even as Oak Haven began to open up, Miller found himself facing a growing sense of isolation. The story had become an obsession, consuming him in ways he hadn't anticipated. It was as though Thomas and Emily had woven themselves into his life, transforming his work from mere duty into a personal mission. He felt responsible for telling their story with honesty and care, for preserving their love and legacy. But the weight of that responsibility was beginning to take its toll. Seeing his struggle, Sarah, the therapist he had met during one of the community gatherings, offered him a gentle reminder that even he needed support. Their professional conversations about mental health had slowly turned into friendship, a bond that provided Miller with a quiet solace. Sarah understood the emotional weight he carried, and she urged him to take a step back, to remind himself that he didn't have to bear the burden alone. One evening, over coffee in her office, Sarah broached the subject. "You're giving so much of yourself to this story, Daniel," she said softly, her eyes full of concern. "But remember that your own well-being matters too. It's easy to lose yourself when you're carrying someone else's history." Miller nodded, though he knew it would be difficult to step away. The Blackwoods had become more than just a story to him. They were a reflection of his own unresolved questions about love, loss, and purpose. But he understood the wisdom in Sarah's words, and he felt a warmth, an understanding in her presence that offered him a sense of grounding. With Sarah's encouragement, Miller returned to the community center the next day, feeling renewed, determined to honor the story with a clearer mind. This time, as he shared Emily's final journal entries with the audience, he realized that he wasn't just telling their story. He was inviting Oak Haven to continue it, to carry forward the lessons of compassion, empathy, and the importance of unspoken connections. As the readings continued, the townspeople began to embrace the message embedded in Thomas and Emily's lives. More people began attending the support groups at the library, and local leaders organized workshops on mental health and communication, hoping to foster the kind of openness that might prevent future tragedies of silence. One day, as the townspeople gathered for a reading, a young woman named Laura approached the podium. She was shy, her hands trembling, as she held a piece of paper in front of her. Laura had grown up in Oak Haven, but she'd always kept to herself, hiding her struggles with depression and isolation. But something in the Blackwoods story had resonated deeply within her, giving her the courage to speak. "I've lived in Oak Haven my whole life," she began, her voice wavering. "I watched Thomas Blackwood from afar, and I never thought I had anything in common with him. But reading his story, it made me realize that I, too, have been living in silence. I, too, have felt like a ghost in my own life." Her confession brought tears to the eyes of many in the room. And as she spoke, others felt emboldened to share their own stories, the quiet struggles that had gone unnoticed for so long. Laura's words, inspired by Thomas and Emily, became a catalyst for a collective reckoning, a movement toward honesty and connection that reshaped Oak Haven in profound ways. Through it all, Miller found himself increasingly drawn to Sarah. Her compassion, her unwavering commitment to helping others, mirrored his own. In her company, he found the rare comfort of someone who truly understood him, who could see past the uniform to the heart of the man beneath. Over time, their connection deepened, evolving into a partnership that felt like a natural extension of the journey he had begun with Thomas and Emily. One evening, as they walked by the lake under the soft glow of the moon, Sarah spoke of her own experiences with loss, the quiet battles she had fought alone. She shared memories of a difficult past, of friendships that had ended too soon, of dreams abandoned and rediscovered. For Miller, it was as though another secret door had been opened, revealing the layers of a woman he had come to cherish. Together, they stood by the water's edge, gazing at the memorial stone engraved with Emily's final words, "Tell him I loved him." The words seemed to shimmer in the moonlight, a reminder of the fragility and beauty of love, of the strength required to face life's unknowns. Miller took Sarah's hand, feeling a quiet, profound gratitude for her presence. In that moment, he realized that the Blackwoods story had not only changed the town, it had changed him. Through their journey, he had found a new understanding of love, a deeper appreciation for vulnerability, and the courage to open himself to the possibilities that lay ahead. And as he held Sarah's hand, he knew that Thomas and Emily's legacy would live on, not just in Oak Haven, but in every life their story had touched. The town had become a beacon of compassion and connection, a place where people came to heal, to share, to remember that they were not alone. In their love, their secrets, and their silence, Thomas and Emily had left a gift for Oak Haven, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the enduring power of empathy. The awakening of Oak Haven. Oak Haven was transforming. The town that had once been defined by its quiet routines and close-knit, unchanging nature had opened itself in ways no one could have foreseen. Inspired by Thomas and Emily's story, the townspeople were changing their lives, cultivating connections where silence had once prevailed. New traditions and support systems were emerging, fueled by an unspoken promise to never let another life become lost to isolation or grief. Officer Miller, now a central figure in this transformation, saw his role evolve from keeper of Thomas's legacy to facilitator of Oak Haven's awakening. The readings had taken on an almost sacred quality, each session an opportunity for the townspeople to gather, reflect, and heal together. Miller and Geraldine, the town historian, continued to carefully select passages from Thomas and Emily's writings, revealing deeper layers of their relationship, their struggles, and their dreams. At one such reading, the crowd was unusually large, and a quiet hum of anticipation filled the air. It was to be a special session, focusing on some of Thomas's later writings, entries that traced the depths of his grief, but also hinted at something unexpected, the slow, painful rebirth of his hope. Geraldine began to read, her voice steady yet laced with the emotional resonance of Thomas's words. "The garden has always been her gift to me," Thomas had written, his penmanship more delicate, his words revealing a man holding on to life's small beauty with all he had left. "I find myself there more often now, surrounded by the things she loved. Flowers she chose, plants we grew together. It's as if I can feel her here, in every bloom, in every leaf that reaches for the sunlight. For the first time in years, I don't feel so alone." The passage revealed Thomas's quiet transformation, his journey toward accepting a love that had not faded but rather deepened through his grief. Though he had shut himself off from the world, Thomas had poured himself into his garden, tending to each plant as though it were a continuation of Emily's memory. The revelation touched the townspeople, many of whom remembered passing by his garden, glimpsing him through the gaps in the hedge, never imagining the depth of purpose behind his solitude. After the reading, an unexpected visitor approached the podium. Emily's niece, a woman named Margaret who had traveled from out of town, stood silently for a moment, gazing out at the faces of Oak Haven. She was a woman in her 30s, poised but visibly moved by the gathering. Her voice was soft yet clear, and it carried a weight that captured everyone's attention. "I never knew my Aunt Emily personally," Margaret began, her voice faltering slightly. "But her legacy was always a part of my life. My father, Thomas's estranged brother, spoke of her often, especially as he grew older. She was his younger sister, and they were close until the accident. And then Thomas withdrew from us too. I came here because I wanted to understand them both, to find closure for a family separated by tragedy." The room held its breath as Margaret continued, revealing pieces of a family history that no one in Oak Haven had ever heard. She explained how the accident that had claimed Emily's life had also fractured the relationship between Thomas and his brother. Thomas, devastated, had turned inward, cutting off the last remaining ties to his family. Margaret's father had tried to reach out, but his letters had gone unanswered. It was only in his later years that he had come to understand that Thomas's silence was not a rejection, but a wound that had never healed. "But I don't want to hold on to that silence," Margaret said, her voice firm with determination. "I want to break the cycle. I want to know this town that was so much a part of their lives, to walk the paths they walked, to hear the stories of those who knew them." She looked at Miller with a faint smile, acknowledging his efforts. "Thank you for bringing them back to us." After Margaret's words, the townspeople embraced her warmly, sharing their own memories of Emily and Thomas, filling in the gaps in her family history. And in that act of sharing, Oak Haven forged a new bond, connecting Margaret to the legacy of her aunt and uncle. She stayed in town for the following weeks, taking part in the readings, joining in the support groups, and forming connections with people who had been touched by her family's story. As the weeks passed, Margaret became an integral part of Oak Haven, helping to organize new community projects. Inspired by Thomas's love for his garden, she and other townspeople collaborated to create a community garden in his honor. They dedicated a patch of land by the lake to grow flowers and plants native to the area, hoping it would serve as a gathering place where people could come together, share stories, and find solace in nature. They called it the Blackwood Garden, a testament to a love that had bridged generations and healed a town. The garden flourished, with volunteers of all ages planting seeds, tending to flowers, and sharing in the quiet labor of cultivating beauty. It became a sanctuary where people could grieve, reflect, And remember, a living tribute to the love Thomas and Emily had shared. As the garden grew, so did the sense of unity in Oak Haven. Neighbors who had once passed each other in silence now greeted each other warmly, and the town itself seemed to radiate a renewed vitality. Amid these transformations, Miller found himself facing his own struggles. Though he had poured himself into honoring Thomas and Emily's story, the weight of his role had begun to wear on him. The journey had been deeply fulfilling, but also emotionally taxing, and he felt the need for guidance, for support beyond what he could find within himself. Sarah, the therapist who had become a dear friend and confidant, recognized the signs of burnout in him and encouraged him to take time for self-reflection. She invited him to attend a weekend retreat focused on personal healing and mindfulness, a gathering held at a retreat center just outside Oak Haven, nestled in the woods. The center's focus on mental well-being and self-compassion seemed to align perfectly with the path Miller had been traveling, and after some initial hesitation, he agreed. The retreat became a turning point for Miller. Away from the town, the notebooks, and the weight of responsibility, he found himself reflecting not just on Thomas and Emily's story, but on his own journey. He thought about his life before the Blackwoods, about the ideals that had first driven him to join the police force: justice, integrity, and the desire to make a difference. The experience of unearthing Thomas and Emily's legacy had given him a new perspective on these ideals, deepening his empathy and reshaping his sense of purpose. During a quiet evening at the retreat, Sarah and Miller shared a moment of unexpected vulnerability. They sat beneath the stars, the only sounds the distant rustling of leaves and the soft call of an owl in the trees. Sarah spoke of her past, the struggles she'd endured and overcome, the clients who had taught her invaluable lessons, and the love she'd found in helping others heal. "You've become a part of Oak Haven's story too, you know," she said softly, turning to look at him. "You're not just telling their story. You're transforming the town, its people, its history, its future. And I think you've transformed yourself along the way." Her words resonated deeply, and for the first time, Miller felt the quiet recognition that he had indeed changed. He had become not only a keeper of memories, but a bridge between past and present, carrying forward a legacy of love, resilience, and compassion. As their conversation deepened, a quiet understanding grew between them, one that transcended words. Miller and Sarah had been brought together by the Blackwoods story, and now, under the canopy of stars, their connection blossomed into something new. In each other, they found the comfort of shared purpose, the strength of companionship, and the quiet promise of a future they hadn't anticipated. When Miller returned to Oak Haven, he carried with him a newfound peace. He threw himself into the community work with renewed energy, organizing a mental health awareness week, hosting workshops, and initiating programs that would ensure that no one else in Oak Haven would ever feel the isolation Thomas had endured. Margaret, who had by now fully integrated herself into the town, took over many of the readings, sharing family anecdotes and stories that gave a fuller picture of the Blackwoods legacy. The community garden blossomed under her care, and she worked tirelessly to maintain its beauty, seeing it as a personal tribute to the family she had rediscovered. Through it all, Oak Haven thrived. The town that had once been a place of quiet whispers and reserved glances had transformed into a community of empathy, resilience, and connection. Inspired by the love story of Thomas and Emily, they had learned to look beyond the surface, to recognize the hidden struggles of their neighbors, and to offer compassion without judgment. One bright spring morning, the townspeople gathered for a special ceremony in the Blackwood Garden. They dedicated a small memorial stone, engraved with both Thomas and Emily's names, along with a single, simple line: "Love endures." It was a reminder of the journey they had taken, a testament to the lives that had touched so many, and a beacon for the future. As the ceremony concluded, Miller stood beside Sarah, their hands intertwined, watching the townspeople place flowers by the stone, each gesture an act of love, a promise to carry forward the legacy they had inherited. In the months that followed, Miller continued his work with a renewed sense of purpose, his connection with Sarah deepening as they supported each other in ways neither had anticipated. They had become more than just friends. They were partners in both life and purpose, each finding strength and solace in the other. And Oak Haven, forever changed, flourished in the wake of Thomas and Emily's love, a town that had learned the value of connection, the strength of community, and the enduring power of empathy. The Blackwoods story had become part of the town's soul, woven into its very identity, a testament to love that had transcended time, silence, and death. Yet, as Miller knew well, this was not an ending but a beginning, a legacy that would continue to grow, reminding Oak Haven and all who heard their story that love, in all its forms, endures beyond all else. The legacy of love. Years had passed since Oak Haven's transformation began, catalyzed by the quiet tragedy of Thomas and Emily Blackwood. What had once been a modest town known for its reserved inhabitants had blossomed into a community renowned for its empathy, openness, and commitment to mental wellness. The Blackwoods story, once a symbol of unspoken sorrow, had grown into a cherished part of the town's identity, drawing visitors from far and wide who came to experience Oak Haven's spirit and to visit the Blackwood Garden, which had become a sanctuary for healing, reflection, and remembrance. The garden was in full bloom that summer, a vibrant array of wildflowers, roses, and lavender filling the air with their heady perfume. Along winding stone paths, benches nestled beneath blossoming cherry trees provided shaded spaces for quiet reflection. Families gathered, friends met for conversations, and individuals came to seek solace. The garden had become a place of stories, its air thick with unspoken memories shared between generations. Officer Daniel Miller, now Captain Miller, had been deeply woven into this transformation. He had become more than just a figure in the town's police department. He was a symbol of Oak Haven's heart. His involvement with the Blackwood story had ignited a passion within him that he'd never expected. A dedication not just to justice, but to community healing, a desire to foster connections and understanding that would bridge the gaps left by time, pain, and silence. And Sarah, who had become his steadfast partner in life, as well as in purpose, continued to be his unwavering support. Her work as a therapist and mental health advocate was now widely recognized, and she had established Oak Haven's first mental health clinic, a modest building just outside of town. Together, they had built a life around helping others, a bond that had grown from shared purpose and had evolved into a love deepened by each challenge they faced together. One warm afternoon, they stood hand in hand, gazing out over the Blackwood Garden as families strolled along its paths and children chased each other between the rows of flowers. In the heart of the garden, a statue of intertwined roses had been placed, a tribute to Thomas and Emily's enduring love. Beneath it, a plaque read, "A love that endures is a love that heals." Miller felt a profound sense of peace as he watched the community thrive. Yet he also sensed there was one last chapter in Thomas and Emily's story that remained untold. Despite the years he had spent unearthing their lives, he felt that a piece of their legacy still lingered in the shadows, waiting to be discovered. He and Sarah had spoken of it often, and they both believed that if the story were to reach its true conclusion, it had to include their final resting place. The Blackwoods graves, located in the town's old cemetery, were marked by simple stones, almost forgotten amidst the lush greenery. But Miller and Sarah had decided it was time to honor them in a way that would reflect the love and legacy they had left behind. They proposed an idea to the town council, a memorial service to honor Thomas and Emily's lives, to bring closure not just for the Blackwoods but for Oak Haven itself. The town council agreed wholeheartedly, and plans were set for a summer evening ceremony that would coincide with the annual Oak Haven Day, a celebration of the town's heritage. This year, the day would be dedicated to the memory of Thomas and Emily, to their story, and to the journey of healing that had begun with them. On the day of the ceremony, townspeople and visitors alike gathered in the cemetery as the sun began to set, casting a warm, golden glow across the scene. White roses, symbolizing enduring love and remembrance, had been placed on each grave, and lanterns lined the pathways, illuminating the space with a soft, ethereal light. The air was thick with reverence as families and friends stood side by side, awaiting the start of the memorial. At the podium, Margaret, Emily's niece who had long since become a cherished member of the Oak Haven community, spoke first. She shared stories of the family she had come to know through the townspeople's memories, of the love she had discovered that spanned generations and had ultimately brought her back to her roots. Her voice wavered with emotion as she recounted how, in discovering her aunt and uncle's story, she had found a family and a place where she belonged. Next, Geraldine, the historian who had helped uncover Thomas's writings, recounted the early days of the journey, when the notebooks had first been discovered, and how each line of Thomas's words had reshaped their understanding of love, grief, and resilience. And finally, Miller took the podium. He looked out over the faces of the people he had come to call family, and felt the weight of the journey they had taken together. "I think if Thomas and Emily could see us now," he began, his voice steady but filled with emotion, "they would be proud, not just of this town, but of each of you. You took their story, their pain, and their love, and you made something beautiful from it. You showed that love doesn't end with loss. It transforms, it carries forward, and it builds a legacy that endures." His gaze swept over the crowd, resting on familiar faces, on people who had grown and changed with him. We often talk about Thomas and Emily's love story as though it were something extraordinary, something rare. But the truth is, we all carry a piece of their story within us. We all know what it means to love and lose, to struggle and endure. And today, we honor not just their legacy, but the resilience within each of us, the courage it takes to love deeply and to heal. As he stepped down from the podium, a silence hung in the air, as if every person there was connected by a thread of shared experience, of unspoken understanding. Margaret stepped forward again, holding a bundle of white roses. One by one, people came forward to take a rose, leaving it by the graves, a gesture of unity and remembrance. The cemetery was soon adorned with hundreds of white roses, a field of love and respect blooming in the twilight. The ceremony closed with a moment of silence, broken only by the soft rustling of leaves and the quiet breaths of the people gathered, each lost in their own thoughts, their own memories. As night fell, the townspeople moved to the town square, where lanterns were strung from tree to tree, casting a gentle glow over the festivities. Laughter filled the air, music drifted from a small band on the corner, and children chased fireflies under the stars. Oak Haven Day had begun, and the celebration was more than just a gathering. It was a living testament to the strength of the community, to the resilience they had cultivated together. The Blackwood story was no longer just a tragedy or even a love story. It had become the heartbeat of Oak Haven, a pulse that flowed through each person, uniting them in purpose and hope. The town had emerged from the shadows of grief, each person carrying forward a piece of the legacy, a reminder that even in the quietest lives, the most isolated moments, there was always the possibility of connection and healing. Miller and Sarah walked hand in hand through the crowd, watching the joy unfold around them. They had built a life together rooted in purpose, their love strengthened by the journey they had shared. They paused by the Blackwood garden, now illuminated by soft lantern light, watching as families gathered near the statue of intertwined roses. Margaret was there, laughing with a group of children as she showed them how to tend to the flowers. And in that moment, Miller understood that the Blackwood story had reached its true conclusion, not in words, but in action, in the lives they had touched, in the town they had changed. Thomas and Emily had left behind a legacy that transcended time, a love that had become a foundation upon which a new Oak Haven was built. As he stood there, Sarah leaned into him, her voice a gentle whisper. "We did it, Daniel. We carried their story forward, just as they would have wanted." Miller nodded, his heart full. He looked out over the town, over the garden blooming in the night, and he knew that their story would never truly end. It would live on in each person who walked those paths, who placed a flower by the memorial stone, who carried the message of love and resilience forward. And as the stars shimmered above Oak Haven, casting their gentle light over the town, Miller felt a quiet certainty settle within him. That love, in its truest form, was not bound by time or loss. It endured, a silent, steadfast force that brought life to those who nurtured it. And in that knowledge, he found peace, knowing that Thomas and Emily's legacy would live on not just in Oak Haven, but in every heart their story had touched.